Hey guys, tonight we are wandering the drafty corridors of a palace that never really sleeps, where the candlelight doesn't just flicker, it watches you back. You hear your own footsteps echo off the polished stones, and you catch the faint scent of wax and damp wool as you trail your fingers along a wall that's older than most family trees. Somewhere, a maid's bucket clinks against the flagstones, and you wonder if she's really cleaning or just pretending to so she can eavesdrop. You're here with Elizabeth, not the weathered, steely ruler you picture on coin faces, but the teenage princess who has learned far too early that every smile in court might be bait. You probably won't survive this place if you forget that lesson. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are in the world right now and what time it is, because I'm curious how far these whispers travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge alongside her as she moves at a pace that suggests she has nowhere urgent to be. But her eyes keep sliding to corners where the shadows run deepest. She has been in and out of favor with astonishing speed, favored one day, suspected the next. You can almost hear the court's whispered tally. One daughter of a disgraced queen, half-sister to a mercurial monarch, and a Protestant in a Catholic tide. She is already learning to read lips from across a room, to catch the tiniest flinch in someone's cheek. It's not paranoia if they really do send people to have a friendly word with you at dawn. Somewhere in the garden beyond the long gallery, a hunting dog barks twice, then falls silent. The smell of rosemary and damp earth filters in through a cracked casement. Elizabeth leans a little toward it, as if the outside air is the only honest thing she's breathed all day. In this palace, even the tapestries seem to have ears. Historians still argue whether her early caution was a natural instinct or drilled into her by relentless tutors who reminded her daily that her mother's fate could just as easily be hers. When you pass a doorway, you glimpse a flash of crimson velvet, the skirt of a lady who disappears just as quickly. Elizabeth notices too. She doesn't mention it. That's her style already. Collect the detail, keep it in a drawer in your mind, pull it out later if you need leverage. You have to admire the quiet discipline of it. You enter the solar, a room washed in a pale winter light, dust motes drifting like lazy snow. Here she sits at a table strewn with books, half-written letters, and a plate holding what might once have been a pear. Her tutor drones about the finer points of rhetoric, but she is listening with one ear and sorting through possibilities with the other. Which courtier's attention to encourage, which to deflect, and how to avoid both without making enemies. The fringe tidbit here is that she sometimes scribbles little coded verses in the margins of her Latin texts, playful riddles, or tiny insults cloaked in allegory. You imagine a future historian squinting at those and deciding they're harmless doodles. The tutor clears his throat, pulling her focus back. But there's a twitch in her smile. She knows how little of his sermon she'll remember, and how much of her own quiet plotting she'll keep. She's learned that a girl who is underestimated is safer than one who is feared. Safer, but not safe. You follow her later into the chapel, its stone columns rising like a frozen forest. The air smells faintly of smoke and incense, a blend that makes you aware of the fire hazard and the piety in equal measure. She bows her head, murmurs the responses, and all the while you can feel her measuring who kneels when, who looks around during the prayer, and who avoids her gaze entirely. Even here, under the eyes of God, politics leaks into the floor like a stubborn damp patch. There's a ripple of movement at the back, a messenger slipping inside, hat in hand. Elizabeth doesn't look at him, but her shoulders stiffen just enough for you to notice. The service ends, the choir's voices fading into the stones, and she moves away quickly, skirts brushing the edge of the pews. The message can wait until she's in a place where ears are fewer and walls are thicker. You realize she lives in a constant state of triage, sorting each moment into safe enough or store it for later. Outside, the air is sharp with frost, and the gravel crunches underfoot. She draws her cloak tighter, and the fur trim tickles her chin. A cluster of younger ladies-in-waiting trail behind, chattering about a feast planned for the end of the month. Elizabeth smiles faintly, but doesn't join in. You suspect she is thinking about whether she'll still be invited by then, or whether she'll be ordered to stay in her rooms. That's the kind of instability you can't explain in polite conversation. You pass a row of hedges clipped into the shapes of mythical beasts. One has lost an ear to an overzealous gardener, and Elizabeth reaches out to pat the stump as you go by. Everything loses something here, she might say, if she trusted you enough. You feel the weight of the words she doesn't speak. Later, in the warmth of her private chamber, a relative term, the fire is small, and the draft is ambitious. You watch her unpin her hair. Copper strands fall over her shoulders, catching the light. She sits before the mirror, the glass warped just enough to make her reflection look like a stranger's. In that distorted face, you see the calculations again. What to reveal, what to conceal, and to whom. The mainstream historical fact slips in here. Elizabeth's formative years were spent not just in study, but in a series of houses where she was both guest and hostage, her comfort depending entirely on the mood of the ruler. That does something to a person. She rubs her hands together, warming them, and you think how small they look against the heavy oak of the chair. Small, but capable of holding a quill steady while she writes words that could save or end her life. Outside the shutter, a gust of wind rattles the latch. Somewhere below, footsteps stop abruptly on the stairs, then turn away. You both listen until they fade. When she speaks, it's about a book she's reading, a history of ancient queens, women who navigated palaces just as full of traps as hers. She smiles at the thought of one who allegedly poisoned her enemies with perfume. The smile is thin but genuine. Probably exaggerated, she says, though you sense she's filing away the idea under just in case. The night deepens. In the corridor beyond her chamber, you hear the slow scrape of someone dragging a chair across the flagstones. No one comes in. The candle burns lower. Elizabeth stretches, then pulls a shawl around her shoulders. The day is over, but the watchfulness is. She has learned that in this place, you can sleep, but you must never be entirely asleep. You leave her there, head bent over her book, the fire sighing in the grate, the air thick with the knowledge that she is still alive mostly because she understands, better than most adults here, that every person you meet in this palace is either a friend who might betray you or an enemy who might decide not to, at least for now. And in the long, echoing silence, you understand why she already moves like a queen who doesn't need a crown to remind her of the stakes. The air is heavier here, and you can smell it before you feel it, the faint dampness that clings to thick stone when sunlight never quite reaches it. Your boots, or what you've borrowed to pretend you belong here, make a hollow, uncertain sound on the tower's worn steps. Elizabeth doesn't rush. She keeps her back straight, one hand brushing the cold wall as if she needs to prove to herself it's solid. She has been here before, but not like this. Last time she wasn't a visiting guest. She was the suspected traitor. You imagine the difference between arriving in daylight under polite escort and being hauled in before dawn with no guarantee of leaving again. Historians still argue whether she was truly in danger of execution or whether the crown only meant to frighten her into obedience. That's the kind of uncertainty that keeps you up at night. A draft snakes through the narrow passage, tugging at your sleeves, carrying with it the smell of the river just outside. The Thames is so close you can almost hear it licking at the tower's walls, whispering about escape routes you're never going to take. She glances toward a barred slit of a window, where a thin stripe of winter light lies across the stones like a blade. You sense she's remembering the room they gave her furnished, yes, but the kind of comfort that feels more like a bribe than kindness. The guard leading you pauses at an iron-banded door. The metal studs catch the light like tiny, sharp eyes. Elizabeth steps past him into a chamber that is both larger and smaller than you expect. Large enough to pace in, small enough that you could never forget the walls. The air smells of old smoke and a trace of mildew, the kind of scent that doesn't come out of fabric, no matter how many times you air it. Her hand hovers over the back of a chair, and for a moment, she's somewhere else entirely, hearing voices from years ago, some kind, some cruel, all deciding her fate without her in the room. She sits now, not because she's tired, but because she wants to see the space from the position she once occupied for days that blurred into one another. A pigeon coos outside, the sound muffled through the narrow opening high above. You imagine her younger self counting those sounds, measuring time in bird calls, because no one would tell her the hour. Your eyes wander to a scratch in the wall near the fireplace, perhaps just careless handling of a poker, or perhaps something carved in boredom or defiance. The fringe tidbit here is that prisoners sometimes marked the stone with symbols only they understood, part diary, part spell, to guard against the worst. You wonder if she did the same somewhere, a little ghost of her thoughts still clinging to the mortar. The guard clears his throat, and you notice his posture, half deference, half unease. He knows the stories. The princess who walked out of the tower alive was rare enough to earn a kind of superstition. Elizabeth catches his glance and holds it a beat too long, enough to remind him that she remembers him as much as he remembers her. You follow her into the adjoining chamber, smaller still, where a brazier smolders weakly in the corner. She doesn't touch it. Instead, she walks to the window, where a single bar cuts the view in half. The river beyond moves sluggishly under a gray sky. She tilts her head, the way you do when you're trying to see something through fog. Maybe she's picturing the barges that bring condemned prisoners past this spot. Maybe she's picturing herself on one, hearing the creak of oars. The silence here is thick enough to lean on. When she speaks, her voice is lower, as though the stones might overhear. You can smell the fear here, she says, and it's not a metaphor. The place holds on to it, weaving it into the air so it lingers for centuries. You believe her. As the tour, if you can call it that, winds downward, the steps spiral tight, and you feel your shoulder brush the central column. The dim light shifts, orange and restless, as you pass a torch bracket. Somewhere in the dark, you hear the shuffle of other visitors, though they keep their distance. You imagine how it must have felt to be marched down here, not knowing if the next door would open to daylight or the block. Elizabeth slows near a heavy archway. The stones are darker here, slick with moisture, and the ceiling dips low enough that you duck instinctively. The space beyond is little more than a cell, bare walls, a bucket in the corner, a bench that might as well be a stone coffin. She looks at it for a long moment, her jaw tightening, then steps back without crossing the threshold. That's not where they put her, but she's seen enough to know the difference between her confinement and others. Even privilege in the tower is still the tower. When you emerge into the courtyard, the cold air tastes fresher than it should. You notice Elizabeth's shoulders loosen just slightly. Her eyes sweep the space, noting the guards, the visitors, the high walls. She doesn't look relieved, just resolved. The mainstream historical fact slips in here. She was eventually released and restored to a cautious sort of favor. But the memory of this place never really left her. Even years later, as queen, she could point to the spot where she had walked through the gates and felt the weight of survival settle on her like an extra cloak. She crosses toward the outer wall, where the wind snatches at her cloak and tugs loose strands of hair across her face. The river glints dully beyond, and somewhere upriver a bell tolls. You think about the difference between hearing that sound as a free woman and hearing it when you're locked behind stone. She doesn't speak about it, but the look she casts at the water is its own kind of confession. There's a peculiar quiet between you as you leave. The cobbles shift slightly underfoot, slick from a morning mist. Elizabeth pauses once, her fingers grazing the rough surface of the wall, as though to remind herself she can choose to let go now. You can tell she is measuring the tower not just as a building, but as a lesson. Never be in a position where someone else decides whether you walk out. Back through the gate, the air feels different. The sunlight slightly brighter even through the clouds. She doesn't look back until you're both well beyond the walls. And when she does, it's not a glance of nostalgia or fear. It's something colder, more calculated. The kind of look you give an old enemy you've decided to keep alive, just to remind them you can. The carriage waits, its wheels sunk a little into the muddy ground. She steps up without help, settles into the corner, and draws the curtain back just enough to see the tower recede behind you. Her fingers tap lightly against her knee, not in nerves, but in thought. You can almost see the tower shrinking into a symbol rather than a threat, becoming another piece on the board she will eventually play to her advantage. The road away is uneven, jolting you both. Outside, market stalls are packing away under the dull sky, the smell of baked bread mixing with river damp. Somewhere, a man calls out the day's news, his voice too faint to make out the words. Elizabeth watches it all with a detachment that feels earned once you've walked out of the tower. A rutted road and cold air aren't much of a hardship. As the city thins into open fields, she leans back, finally letting the curtain fall. You suspect she's replaying every face she saw today, every corner she passed, every smell of stone and river and smoke. Some things you keep close because they remind you who you were. Others you keep because they remind you never to be that person again. For her, the tower is both. And as the wheels keep turning, you find yourself glancing back in your own mind, feeling that heavy shadow follow for a while before it fades into the distance, leaving only the sound of the river and the faint echo of boots on stone. You're standing in a room that smells faintly of lavender, beeswax, and the warm iron tang of fresh dye, the peculiar cocktail of a Tudor wardrobe. The light is muted here, filtered through a diamond-paned window that turns the sun into fragments scattered across the rush-covered floor. Elizabeth is at the center of it all, perched on a tall stool, while two ladies fuss with a sleeve so heavy you can hear the fabric sigh when it moves. It isn't just a gown. It's armor made of silk, velvet, and political intent. The gown is a deep crimson, the kind of shade that whispers about both wealth and danger. It catches the light like a threat that's pretending to be a compliment. You watch as a row of pearls is sewn into the cuff, each one gleaming faintly in the candlelight. A court dress here can weigh 20 pounds, more if the embroidery gets ambitious. It's not for comfort, it's for message. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly believed her clothing could sway foreign ambassadors, or whether she simply understood that appearances mattered more than half the speeches she gave. One of the women holding the skirt's train glances toward the door, as if worried someone might come in and catch a glimpse before the queen, the princess, for now chooses to be seen. Elizabeth notices, because she notices everything. She tilts her chin just enough to make her point. She controls the reveal. You step closer, running your hand over a length of black velvet waiting on the table. It's Beds pile smooth in one direction, resistant in the other. It smells faintly of the cedar chest it came from. And you think of all the hours spent in stillness, while garments like this are fitted, refitted, and finally allowed to meet daylight. In the corner, a maid polishes a pair of leather gloves until they look almost wet with shine. Elizabeth glances at them briefly. She's thinking about which pair will send the right message. The mainstream fact slides in here. Gloves in this period weren't just to keep hands warm, but to show off delicate fingers, pale skin, and in some cases, the wearer's ability to afford exotic perfumed leather. But the fringe tidbit you hear whispered between the women is stranger. There's a superstition that a glove worn only once to an important meeting will hold the luck of that day. So you keep it hidden away to use again when you need the same outcome. Whether Elizabeth believes it or not, you can't say. But you notice she doesn't wear just any pair to the same kind of meeting twice. She lifts her arms as the gown is settled over her shoulders, the fabric sliding down with a weight that pulls slightly at her frame. The bodice fits like a promise she can't back out of, stiff, unyielding, laced so tight you wonder how she breathes. You learn to take shallow breaths, she murmurs, almost as if answering you. There's a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, the kind that suggests she knows how absurd it is to fight wars with thread and gemstones, and yet she'll do it anyway. The skirt is spread out across the floor now, an expanse of fabric that turns her into the center of the room, whether she wants it or not. You walk the perimeter, hearing the whisper of it as it moves, smelling the faint, metallic tang of gold thread. Elizabeth watches you with the calm of someone who has already imagined how she will look when she steps into a hall full of people who will be judging her down to the curve of her ruff. A mirror stands in the corner, its surface slightly cloudy, its frame carved with vines and birds. She stands before it, not to admire herself, but to adjust the angle of her chin, to see how the light catches the pearls at her ear, to note whether the gown makes her look taller when she tilts her head just so. There's calculation in every movement. You think of a chessboard, and she's the queen piece testing out the squares before the game begins. Someone brings in a small box lined with blue silk. Inside lies a necklace, gold links interspersed with sapphires, cool to the touch when you lift it. Elizabeth's eyes flick toward it and then away, as if pretending not to care, but you can see the tiny quickening of her breath. She knows exactly which ambassador will be sitting opposite her today, and she knows that the deep blue will remind him of his own country's heraldry. It's a small move, but in her world, small moves can tip balances. As the final adjustments are made, she sits once more, letting her hair be brushed and braided into a style that will hold the heavy jeweled hood in place. You watch the braids take shape, strands crossing over each other like lines of alliances she hasn't yet agreed to. The hairdresser hums under her breath, a tune so low it blends with the rustle of fabric. Elizabeth closes her eyes briefly, the only moment she looks like she's resting. But when she opens them, they are sharp again, assessing the reflection in the mirror as though it might give away a secret. There's a brief interruption, a knock at the door, followed by a servant delivering a folded piece of parchment. Elizabeth takes it without breaking her gaze from the mirror, tucks it under a jeweled comb, and returns her hands to her lap. She'll read it later, when the gown is no longer being fussed over. You wonder how many such notes she receives each week, and how many are less about court gossip and more about subtle warnings. The hood is fitted now, its edge stiff with embroidery. She tests its weight with a tilt of her head, then gives the faintest nod. The women step back, letting her rise. Standing in the full gown, she is transformed, not taller, not physically stronger, but more inevitable, like a storm front that has been building just beyond the horizon. She moves toward the door, the skirt whispering across the floor like a tide pulling back before it crashes forward. As you follow her down the corridor, the scent of the fabrics lingers, spices from distant markets, the sharpness of metal threads, the faint sweetness of the lavender sachets hidden in the seams. You realize that every part of her clothing is speaking for her, telling those who see her that she is wealthy enough to command such materials, disciplined enough to wear them without complaint, and dangerous enough to wield beauty as a weapon. At the top of the stairs, she pauses, hand resting lightly on the banister. Below, the hum of voices grows louder, the gathering she's about to enter. Her eyes flick to you, and there's a spark there, as if she's inviting you to notice what no one else will. The dress is not just for beauty, not just for courtly show. It is a shield and a banner both, and as she takes the first step down, you hear the faintest jingle of hidden charms sewn into the lining. Talismans, perhaps, or maybe just the clever clinking of coins stitched for weight. Either way, you suspect she walks into every room ready for both diplomacy and battle. When she reaches the bottom, the room turns toward her as if pulled by gravity. You stay just behind her shoulder, watching how she lets the silence hang for a heartbeat before she speaks. The gown, the jewels, the careful posture, they've already done half the talking. The rest will be in the words she chooses and the ones she leaves unsaid. And as she moves forward, you see the faces around her shifting, recalculating, reacting. She doesn't smile, not yet. That's another part of the performance. You think back to the piles of fabric, the hours of sewing, the dozens of hands that touched this gown before she wore it. Every stitch has been a step in a plan that no one will fully understand except her. And in that moment, surrounded by courtiers, ambassadors, and would-be allies, you realize the truth. She's not just wearing a dress, she's wearing her strategy. And it fits perfectly. The parchment is thick, the ink a deep brown that catches the light when you tilt it, like it wants to tell you its secrets before you've even read them. Elizabeth's fingers hesitate just long enough over the wax seal to make you think she's weighing whether this particular piece of correspondence should even survive the next few minutes. You're close enough to smell the faint beeswax and smoke clinging to it, the scent of a letter that's traveled in someone's pocket, pressed against their body for warmth and secrecy. The seal bears a crest you don't quite recognize, though you know she does. Her eyes flicker with something between suspicion and amusement before she cracks it open in one clean motion. The paper sighs as it unfolds, the creases deep enough to suggest it's been read, folded, hidden, and reread again before it reached her. You lean in slightly, not enough to be intrusive, but enough to see the spidery script marching across the page like a column of ants, careful, deliberate, and possibly poisonous. She reads in silence, her face a mask. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's restraint in moments like this was genuine composure or an artful performance, but you can see the subtle signs. The way her eyes pause slightly longer on certain words, the twitch at the corner of her mouth that could be irritation or amusement, the shift in her breathing that makes you think the contents are less than flattering. You can't read all of it from where you stand, but you catch fragments, references to urgent matters, a change in the wind, and a name you've heard whispered before in rooms where the shutters were closed. When she's done, she doesn't fold it neatly. Instead, she crumples it slightly, as though to erase the orderliness of the hand that wrote it. Then, with a glance toward the door, she tucks it into the hollow spine of a book on her desk. The same book you've seen her use to hide a pressed sprig of rosemary and what might be a scrap of ribbon. You wonder how many messages like this are hidden in plain sight around the room. The fringe tidbit slips in now. Some say Elizabeth kept a private cipher for particularly sensitive notes, one that only a handful of trusted aides could interpret. Whether that's true or just a story meant to make her seem more enigmatic, you can't tell. But the way she lingers over certain lines before hiding the letter makes you think she's decoding something invisible to you. A knock interrupts the quiet, and she calls for the visitor to enter without moving from her seat. A young man, face flushed from the cold outside, steps in and bows. He carries another letter, this one sealed with a thick red blob of wax that's cracked slightly at the edge. Elizabeth takes it, but doesn't open it right away. Instead, she asks him who delivered it. The answer, just a friend of the household, earns a raised eyebrow. She dismisses him with a wave, and when the door closes, she breaks the seal with less ceremony than before. This one is shorter, written in a hurried hand, as though the ink barely had time to dry before it was folded. You catch the words, "not safe," and watch for the falcon, and you wonder if that's literal or some sort of code. She reads it twice, the second time more slowly, before slipping it into the sleeve of her gown. No book hiding this time. This one needs to stay closer to her. You imagine what it must be like to live surrounded by words you can't trust. Every letter a potential trap. Every messenger a potential spy. The mainstream historical fact settles in here. Elizabeth's correspondence was monitored more closely than she often realized, especially in her younger years. And intercepted letters could be used as evidence in plots she never signed onto. It's a wonder she kept writing at all. She moves to the writing table now, its surface a clutter of quills, sealing wax, and tiny pots of ink in different colors. You notice that the black is nearly gone, but the deep green is full, a shade she sometimes uses for messages she claims are personal. She selects a fresh sheet of paper, the fibers rough under her hand, and begins writing in a steady, slanted script. You watch as the words take shape, half-formed sentences scratched out, replaced with phrases that are at once warmer and more ambiguous. She's careful, threading meaning through formality, making sure that if anyone else reads this, they'll find nothing but pleasantries, unless they know how to see what isn't there. Halfway through, she pauses to pour a few drops of sand over the wet ink, letting it rest before brushing it away. The grains scatter like tiny pearls across the desk before she sweeps them into a small wooden tray. The letter is folded, sealed, and set aside for someone she trusts to deliver in person. And even as she finishes it, she begins another, this one shorter, written in that same rapid, spidery style you saw earlier, her eyes darting to the door every so often. A gust of wind rattles the shutters, and she glances up, momentarily distracted. The candle beside her sputters, sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the air. She leans forward, elbows on the table, and stares at the two letters side by side, the public and the private, the safe and the dangerous. You realize she's not just writing for one audience. She's writing for whoever will intercept these, and for the person she hopes will see through the performance. When she finally pushes back from the table, it's with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows she's still being watched, even in her own chambers. She crosses to the window, pushes it open a crack, and slips one of the folded sheets out into the night air. You hear a soft flutter of feathers in response. A pigeon, its leg already bound with a fine cord, takes the note in its tiny tube and disappears into the darkness. The remaining letter she leaves on the desk, in plain sight. That one will be discovered tomorrow, she seems to decide. The more dangerous one is already on its way. In the hallway outside, you hear voices, low, measured, almost casual. She straightens, smooths her skirts, and steps toward the door. Her hand lingers on the latch, and she glances back at the desk, as if to make sure nothing incriminating remains. But you know that the most dangerous things in this room aren't the letters at all there, the thoughts she hasn't yet written down. When she opens the door, two ladies-in-waiting step in, one carrying a tray of spiced wine, the other pretending not to notice the faint smell of smoke from the candle. They chat about the day's schedule, the weather, the expected guests for the evening. Elizabeth responds lightly, her voice warm but detached. If they suspect she's just exchanged messages that could alter the balance of court politics, they don't let it show. As they pour the wine, you catch sight of the sleeve where she tucked the shorter letter earlier. It's gone now. You don't remember seeing her remove it. She catches your eye for just a moment, a glimmer of mischief there, as though she's daring you to figure out where it went. And then she laughs at something one of the women says, the sound soft and musical, as if nothing dangerous has passed between these walls today. The tray is set down, the wine steaming faintly in the cool air. She sips it slowly, the spices catching at her throat, her gaze drifting toward the shuttered window. Outside, somewhere beyond your sight, a pigeon cuts through the night, carrying words that might change the course of her life or end it. And here she sits, calm as ever, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the table, already thinking about what her next letter will say. The hall is bright with firelight, the kind that throws gold across the polished floor and turns every goblet into a jewel. Music hums faintly from the far end, the lilt of strings and the low thump of a drum meant to sound festive, though it feels more like a heartbeat that won't quite slow down. You're at Elizabeth's side as she steps into the long room, skirts swaying, chin set at just the right angle to look gracious but untouchable. Tonight, the air is thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the faint tang of beeswax from the candles lined up in precise, military rows along the tables. Around her, the suitors wait. They come in all varieties, tall and proud, short and quick to laugh. Solemn men in embroidered doublets that glint when they move. Their eyes follow her the way sunflowers follow the sun. But Elizabeth moves as though she's unaware of the effect, even though you know she's counting each gaze, measuring each smile, filing them away for later. Historians still argue whether she ever truly intended to marry, or whether she enjoyed keeping the guessing game alive as a form of political leverage. Watching her now, you can see the appeal of the latter. Every hopeful look is another thread she can weave into her own tapestry. One man steps forward, bowing with a precision that suggests he's practiced it in the mirror. His sleeves are slashed to reveal the pale silk beneath, a flash of wealth and vanity in equal measure. Elizabeth offers him a small nod and lets him kiss her hand, though she withdraws it before his lips quite meet her skin. The gesture is polite enough to be blameless, but sharp enough to keep him at a distance. You can almost hear the quiet, not you tucked inside the movement. At the far end of the room, a table groans under the weight of food, golden loaves, steaming trenchers of meat, bowls of candied fruit. She drifts toward it, and the crowd follows like a tide. You stay close, watching her navigate the crush with ease, letting her eyes settle on each man just long enough for him to think he's caught her attention. It's a careful dance, this art of almost choosing without actually doing so. A suitor from the Spanish court approaches, his dark hair gleaming in the firelight, his smile equal parts charm and calculation. He offers her a plate of sugared almonds, the scent of them sweet and faintly floral. Elizabeth takes one, rolling it between her fingers before eating it, her expression unreadable. The fringe tidbit here: sugared almonds weren't just a treat. They were sometimes used to signal favor or flirtation, depending on who offered them and how they were accepted. If that's the message here, she's sending back a reply that says, perhaps, but not today. The Englishman beside you clears his throat, clearly eager to redirect her attention. He launches into a compliment about her gown, its embroidery as fine as any in Europe. She accepts it with a smile so slight you'd miss it if you weren't looking. You know she's heard better, sharper flattery before breakfast. The music shifts, a livelier tune now, and the crowd reshuffles into pairs for a slow procession around the hall. Several men angle toward her, each hoping to be the one she selects. Instead, she chooses a partner you wouldn't expect, a courtier known more for his loyalty than his ambition. They move together at an unhurried pace, her voice low as they speak. You can't hear the words, but you notice how her hand rests lightly on his arm, as if to say, "I see you," without making a spectacle of it. The others watch, and in watching, they start to wonder what she sees in him that she doesn't see in them. That's the real performance. When the dance ends, she doesn't linger. She drifts away before anyone else can claim her, heading toward the large fireplace where the heat blooms against your skin like the breath of a forge. She warms her hands briefly, eyes scanning the room in the reflection of the polished fireback. You realize she's not just deciding which man she might favor. She's observing who looks jealous, who looks bored, and who looks entirely too confident. Those are the real tells. A servant approaches with a goblet of wine, and she takes it without breaking her gaze from the crowd. She sips, the deep red staining her lips for a moment before she sets the cup aside. The mainstream historical fact here is that Elizabeth's refusal to marry became one of the central pillars of her reign, a decision that allowed her to remain politically independent, but also kept her under constant pressure from both domestic and foreign factions. The hall you stand in tonight is one of many stages where that decision is quietly rehearsed. You follow her to a quieter alcove, partly hidden by a tapestry depicting some improbable hunting scene. Here, the noise is softer, the light dimmer. A suitor you haven't seen before waits there tall, with a serious face and the kind of stillness that suggests he's not used to chasing. He bows, murmurs something in French, and offers her a small book bound in red leather. She takes it, runs her thumb along the edge of the pages, and opens it just enough to see the gold script inside. Whatever she reads makes her lips press together in a way that might be amusement or challenge. She closes the book, thanks him, and tucks it under her arm. You wonder if you'll ever know what was written there. The evening winds on, and the fire burns lower. The music slows again, the scent of the food now mingling with the sharper tang of wine and the faint musk of bodies in close quarters. Elizabeth moves through it all like a ship, cutting through calm waters, smooth, deliberate, entirely aware of the currents beneath the surface. You notice she never stands in one place too long, never lets any man believe he has her undivided attention for more than a breath or two. Even her laughter, soft and musical, is portioned out like a rare spice. When the moment comes to take her leave, she does so without announcement. One minute she's there, the next she's slipping through a side door you close behind. The corridor beyond is cool, the air fresher, the noise of the hall fading with each step. She carries the little red book still, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. You're tempted to ask about it, but you know better. In the privacy of her chambers, she sets it on the desk without opening it again. Her hands move instead to the laces of her gown, loosening them just enough to take a deeper breath. She catches your eye in the mirror and smiles, not the court smile, but the private one, smaller, softer. None of them, she says simply, as if that settles the matter. And perhaps it does. In this game, the absence of a choice is a choice all its own. And for tonight, that's enough. The morning comes late, as if the sun itself has been convinced to linger under its blankets a little longer. Pale light filters through the high, narrow windows, turning the chamber's tapestries into sleepy silhouettes of hunting dogs and improbably large stags. You're already awake, watching Elizabeth stir beneath the weight of her embroidered coverlet, her hair loose for once, a tumble of pale copper across the pillow. She blinks once, twice, then pushes herself upright with the slow determination of someone who has already decided that the day will obey her pace. There's no rush, not here, not now. The court will wait. They always do. Outside, a gentle rain begins, soft enough to sound more like a whisper than a storm. It's the kind of morning that makes you want to stretch into every second, to savor the feel of warm cloth and the scent of yesterday's embers still clinging faintly to the air. Elizabeth notices it too, sitting for a moment with her toes curled against the rug, just listening. She calls for breakfast in a voice that is more request than command, though you know it will be taken as the latter. Soon, a servant appears with a tray fresh bread still steaming from the oven, a wedge of soft cheese, a small dish of preserved quince, and tea, of course, though the leaves are costly and come from far-off places that most courtiers only know from maps. The steam curls upward, carrying with it the earthy, slightly floral scent of the leaves, and she wraps her hands around the cup as if the warmth itself is a kind of counsel. Between sips, she flips through a stack of correspondence. The wax seals are little puzzles in themselves, some ornate, some hastily pressed, some deliberately cracked and resealed in ways that make you wonder how many hands these letters passed through before reaching her desk. She reads quickly, lips twitching now, and then in amusement or annoyance. A note from an old ally, full of gentle flattery. Another from a foreign ambassador, thick with veiled proposals. A third, far more curious, from a woman whose name you don't recognize, but whose words are sharp and precise, asking a question about Elizabeth's future household arrangements. Historians still argue whether such letters were the result of genuine curiosity or deliberate court gossip disguised as polite inquiry. Setting the letters aside, she rises and moves to the window, her bare feet silent on the polished boards. The rain has gathered into thin silver threads, streaking down the glass. She rests her forehead against the cool pane for a moment, watching the garden below. The hedges are trimmed into neat patterns, though the damp makes them sag a little at the edges. Somewhere near the fountain, a gardener in a heavy cloak works methodically, his breath visible in the cool air. Turning away, she calls for her ladies to help with her dressing. They arrive with practiced efficiency, each movement part of a familiar choreography. Linen chemise first, then the stiffened bodice, laces pulled snug, but not tight enough to hinder breathing. The gown chosen today is a deep green, rich enough to look almost black in the dim light, its sleeves lined with fur against the chill. Around her neck, a chain of small pearls catches the light each time she moves. You notice her eyes in the mirror, not merely watching her own reflection, but studying the people behind her, the way they exchange quick glances, the faintest lift of an eyebrow here, the ghost of a smile there. She misses nothing. Even in this seemingly private space, the game continues. Once dressed, she makes her way to the council chamber, a narrower, less gilded room than the grand hall of last night, but no less charged with importance. The air smells faintly of ink and oiled wood, the table worn smooth by years of elbows and restless fingers. Here, the suitors are absent, replaced by men in sober colors, their faces lined from years of politics rather than years of flirtation. Today's discussion circles endlessly around alliances, some practical, some almost absurd in their optimism. A proposal from a small German principality promising trade benefits in exchange for a marriage alliance is met with Elizabeth's polite nod, and a question so subtle you almost miss its barbed edge. And how many ships would you say your navy commands? The answer, mumbled and vague, does not seem to impress her. Between the more tedious points, she occasionally taps her fingers on the table in a slow rhythm, her gaze flicking toward the rain-smeared window. You wonder if she's counting beats to keep from showing her impatience. The mainstream historical fact here is that Elizabeth's council meetings could stretch for hours, with topics ranging from taxation to military defense to the endless question of succession. Yet, in each, she maintained a careful balance, engaged enough to lead, distant enough to avoid being cornered. By midday, the rain has eased into a fine mist. She dismisses the council with a soft word and retreats to the gallery, where the walls are lined with portraits, kings, queens, knights, saints. Some look down with stern approval, others with the kind of blankness that comes from having been painted more for flattery than truth. She walks slowly, pausing now and then before a face, as if weighing their lives against her own. It's here that you spot the fringe detail, a portrait of her father, Henry VII, but altered. The original stern mouth has been softened slightly, the eyes made less cold. Whether this was done to please her or to serve some subtler political purpose, no one will say. She studies it for a long moment, her face unreadable, before moving on. The afternoon brings a brief audience with a delegation from Scotland. Their leader, a wiry man with sharp features, presents her with a gift, a carved box inlaid with pieces of amber. She opens it to find a piece of cloth, delicate lace, yellowed with age. The explanation is that it once belonged to her grandmother, a token of shared heritage. Whether that's true or merely a convenient tale is anyone's guess, and historians still argue over the authenticity of such diplomatic gifts. She thanks them warmly, but sets the box aside without lingering on it. After the formalities, she retreats again, this time to the library. The room is dim and cool, the scent of leather and paper heavy in the air. Rows of books lean toward each other like conspirators, their spines cracked from years of handling. She selects one, something in Latin, and settles into the window seat, curling her legs beneath her skirts. You watch her lips move faintly as she reads, occasionally pausing to make a note in the margin. Time passes slowly here. The only sounds the occasional shift of pages and the faint drip of water outside. At one point, she closes the book and just sits, eyes half closed, listening to the distant hum of the court. You realize it's these moments, quiet, unobserved, that may hold more truth than all the grand gestures of the throne room. When the light begins to fade, she rises and leaves the library without a word. The corridors are cooler now, the stone floors echoing under her steps. She pauses by a window to watch the mist turn to evening fog, blurring the garden into soft shapes. In the distance, a bell tolls the hour, slow and resonant. She returns to her chambers and allows the servants to undo the day's armor, pearls unclasped, bodice loosened, skirts folded carefully away. The fire is lit again, casting warm light across the room. She sits by it with a fresh cup of tea, the steam fogging the edges of her vision. In the quiet, she picks up the red leather book from last night, runs her hand over its cover once more, and finally opens it again. You can't see the words, but her expression shifts, a flicker of amusement, then something sharper, before settling into that calm mask she wears so well. She closes it again and sets it beside her chair, as if the mystery can wait a little longer. Outside, the rain starts again, gentle and steady. The court hums on somewhere beyond these walls, but here, in this warm circle of firelight, she sits as if the whole world is a story she's reading at her own pace. And perhaps it is. The next morning begins with a sharp wind that rattles the shutters before dawn, pulling you from sleep. The fire in the hearth has burned low, leaving the air in the chamber cool enough to make you draw the blankets tighter around your shoulders. Elizabeth is already awake, sitting at the small writing table near the window with a quill in hand. The faint scratch of ink on parchment mixes with the sound of the wind outside. She's still in her nightgown, her hair loose, the candlelight painting gold into its strands. You can tell from her posture that she's deep in thought, her head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing at the words, as if they might shift into better order if she stares hard enough. A half-empty cup of tea sits beside her, the leaves settled into a dark little hill at the bottom. You realize she must have been here for some time, writing before the first servant dared to knock. The letter she's working on appears to be in French, the script precise and flowing. From the few words you catch, it reads as formal, but not cold, a balance of warmth and authority that's difficult to maintain. When she pauses, she taps the feathered end of the quill lightly against the table, glancing out the window at the pale dawn light seeping into the sky. Once finished, she folds the parchment neatly, presses a wax seal onto it, and sets it aside for delivery. There's a certain satisfaction in the way she does it, as if this letter, whatever its contents, has been a small but necessary victory. The servants arrive not long after, carrying in the day's garments. Today's choice is unusual, an ivory gown with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and hem, lighter in tone than the deep, almost forbidding colors she often prefers. Over it, she wears a short, fitted jacket of pale blue velvet, lined with fur to guard against the chill. You suspect she's dressing not only for warmth, but to send a message. Ivory and pale blue together speak of openness, trustworthiness, perhaps even softness. But you've learned by now that such impressions can be as carefully crafted as a treaty. Breakfast is brief. She eats a slice of bread spread with honey, a few dried figs, and drinks another cup of tea. There's no lingering today. An audience has been scheduled with envoys from the Low Countries, and the court is already stirring in anticipation. As she makes her way through the corridors, the air feels charged, the way it does before a storm. The audience takes place in the presence chamber, a room meant to impress more than to comfort. Sunlight, weak though it is, streams through high windows, catching on the gold thread woven into the tapestries. The envoys bow deeply, their black wool cloaks edged with fine embroidery, the badges of their cities gleaming on their chests. Their spokesman, a broad-shouldered man with quick eyes, offers formal greetings before launching into the matter at hand. Trade, specifically the safe passage of English merchants through contested waters. His tone is polite but firm, and Elizabeth listens without interruption, her hands folded lightly in her lap. When he finishes, she leans forward just enough to make the distance between them feel shorter, and responds in clear, confident Dutch. The reaction is immediate. A ripple of surprise and respect moves through the delegation. The conversation continues for some time, touching on fishing rights, the pricing of imported grain, and the mutual defense of merchant vessels. She never raises her voice, but every sentence is edged with precision. By the end, the spokesman is smiling faintly, nodding more than speaking. You sense that she's given ground in some places and held it firmly in others, though it's difficult to tell which is which without seeing the agreements written down. When the envoys depart, she remains seated for a moment, gazing at the space where they stood. Then she rises, adjusts her sleeves, and moves on as though the entire exchange has been nothing more than a warm-up for the day. The afternoon brings a more private matter, a meeting with her master of the horse in the stables. The air smells of hay and leather, the earthy warmth of the horses mixing with the sharper tang of oiled tack. Elizabeth seems more relaxed here, running her gloved hand along the neck of a dappled gray mare, speaking in low tones to the man beside her. They discuss the condition of the royal horses, the schedule for the next hunt, and a delivery of new saddles from a craftsman in Italy. At one point, she removes her gloves and takes the reins of a young bay stallion, leading him in a slow circle. The horse tosses his head once, but settles quickly under her steady hand. You watch her smile, a real one this time, free from the calculation you see in the council chamber. For a moment, she is simply a woman who knows the feel of leather in her palm and the quiet satisfaction of guiding something strong and unpredictable. Back inside, the palace feels warmer after the sharp air of the stables. She spends the next hour in conversation with her physician, a careful man who speaks more in measured cautions than bold prescriptions. They discuss the health of certain courtiers, names you recognize, though she offers no opinion beyond the occasional nod. He leaves her with a small vial of something dark and bitter-smelling, which she sets aside without comment. Later, in the great hall, the tables are being set for supper. The scent of roasted meat and spices drifts in from the kitchens. Courtiers gather in small knots, their voices a low, constant hum beneath the occasional burst of laughter. Elizabeth moves among them with practiced ease, offering a word here, a touch on the arm there. She accepts compliments on the morning's negotiations with a tilt of her head, as though the matter were already forgotten. During the meal, she keeps her own counsel, listening more than speaking. At one point, a young noble leans too close, his words slurring slightly from the wine. She smiles politely, answers with a few clipped sentences, and then turns to speak to the man on her other side, leaving the first to retreat into his cup. After supper, there is music in the gallery. A small group of musicians play lute and viol, their melodies weaving through the murmured conversations. Elizabeth stands near the fire, her eyes following the movement of the bow across the strings. When a courtier asks her to dance, she agrees, stepping onto the floor with the kind of grace that seems effortless only because it has been practiced for years. The dance is slow, almost meditative. Her partner tries to draw her into conversation, but she gives him little more than polite responses, her attention elsewhere. When the music ends, she bows slightly and withdraws, leaving him looking faintly dazed. The evening draws on, and one by one the courtiers take their leave. Elizabeth remains for a time, speaking quietly with her closest advisors in a corner of the gallery. Whatever is discussed, it is done with low voices and quick glances toward the door. When they part, she returns to her chambers alone. Inside, the fire is still burning, the air warm and softly lit. She removes the day's finery herself, folding the pale blue jacket over a chair, unpinning her hair until it falls loose over her shoulders. In the mirror, she studies her own face for a long moment, as if searching for something she can't quite name. Finally, she sits at the writing table again, takes up her quill, and begins another letter. This one, from what you can see, is in English shorter, sharper sentences than the French letter from the morning. She writes quickly, sealing it before the ink is fully dry, then places it in the small locked box by her bed. Outside, the wind has quieted, leaving only the faint creak of the shutters and the soft hiss of the fire. She leans back in her chair, eyes half closed, the weight of the day settling around her like a second gown. For a moment, you think she might speak to you, to herself, but instead she reaches for the red leather book once more. The pages whisper as she opens it, and the firelight catches on the faint traces of gold in the ink. Whatever she finds there holds her completely. The world beyond the circle of light fades to nothing. And in that quiet, you realize that some parts of her life, perhaps the most important parts, will never be fully known, not to her courtiers, not to her historians, and not even to you. The following day begins under a sky the color of pewter, the air heavy with the promise of rain. From the first moments of morning, there is an unspoken urgency in the palace corridors. Servants hurry more quickly than usual, their eyes darting toward the windows, as though the clouds themselves carry messages they can't quite read aloud. Elizabeth is not in her chambers when you wake. Her bed is already neatly made, the coverlet pulled smooth, the fire in the grate newly stoked. You find her in the privy garden, of all places, standing beneath the bare branches of an old elm. She wears a hooded cloak of deep green, fur-lined against the cold, the hem already damp with dew. Beside her is Walsingham, his expression as grave as ever, his hands folded behind his back. They speak in low voices, the kind that carry no farther than the listener's ear. You catch fragments, words like dispatch, intercepted, confirmation, but nothing complete enough to form a clear picture. When she notices you, she nods slightly, and Walsingham takes his leave, disappearing down a side path toward the servants' gate. She lingers for a few moments longer, looking at the pale winter roses that cling stubbornly to life against the garden wall. "They survive the frost," she says at last, her tone not quite casual, "because they do not waste themselves on beauty, only enough to endure." She does not wait for a reply, but turns and walks back toward the palace. Inside, the day unfolds with a deliberate pace. A messenger arrives from the north, his horse lathered from the ride. The mud on his boots is still wet as he kneels to deliver a sealed packet into Elizabeth's hands. She opens it immediately, scanning the lines with a face that betrays nothing. When she finishes, she folds the parchment carefully and slips it into the sleeve of her gown. The messenger is given wine and bread before being sent on his way, but no one else is told the contents of the letter. Mid-morning brings the council together in the small chamber off the great hall. The room is warm from a pair of fires burning in opposite hearths, but the air is thick with tension. Maps are spread across the table, weighted at the corners with heavy candlesticks. Elizabeth stands at the head, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the map, her eyes fixed on the narrow channel between England and France. The discussion is brisk, almost sharp-edged. Ships, supplies, weather patterns, the reliability of certain captains. Each topic is raised, examined, and dismissed or decided upon with a precision that leaves little room for hesitation. When one counselor questions the cost of reinforcing a particular port, Elizabeth fixes him with a level look. "It is dearer," she says softly, "to lose a shore than to guard it." The man bows his head and says no more. By noon, the council is dissolved, and she retreats to her private audience chamber for a series of smaller meetings. A merchant from London petitions for compensation after pirates seized his cargo. A widow seeks the return of land seized by her late husband's creditors. A young officer reports on the state of the militia in his county, his voice shaking slightly as he addresses her. In each case, Elizabeth listens fully, asks pointed questions, and delivers her answer without hesitation. Sometimes she grants what is asked. Sometimes she refuses, but always in a manner that leaves the petitioner certain they have been heard. The afternoon rain arrives at last, drumming against the leaded glass windows and darkening the courtyards. Elizabeth uses the enforced indoors to meet with her musicians. The group gathers in a small chamber near her apartments, their instruments propped against the wall. She listens to a new composition, her head tilted, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee in time with the rhythm. When they finish, she offers a few suggestions, slower here, more forceful there, until the piece takes on a shape she seems satisfied with. Later, she sends for her ladies and has them bring out a small casket of jewels. It's not for adornment. She is choosing pieces to send as gifts. Each selection is deliberate: a brooch for the wife of an ally, a pair of pearl earrings for a foreign envoy's sister. Gifts, she remarks, holding a sapphire ring to the light, speak when words are too costly. She sets the ring aside for a courier to carry abroad. As evening approaches, the rain eases, leaving the air damp and cool. The great hall is lit with dozens of candles, their flames flickering in the drafts from the high doors. Tonight's meal is quieter than usual. Many courtiers are absent, sent on errands, or dismissed to their own estates. Elizabeth dines on venison in a rich sauce, fresh bread, and a small helping of stewed apples. She drinks sparingly of wine, preferring water tonight. After supper, she withdraws to a smaller chamber where only a few close companions are admitted. The fire here burns brightly, and the walls are lined with shelves of books. She takes down a slim volume of Italian poetry and reads aloud in a clear, unhurried voice, translating certain lines for those who do not follow the language. The mood in the room softens. The courtiers sit closer to the fire, the tension of the day melting into the steady cadence of her voice. When the reading ends, she sets the book aside and allows herself to be drawn into a game of chess with one of her oldest advisors. The match is long and quiet, punctuated only by the clink of pieces on the board and the occasional soft laugh when a clever move is made. In the end, she wins, though she claims it was luck rather than skill. Her opponent bows over the board, murmuring that luck of that kind is rare indeed. The night grows late, but she does not yet retire. Instead, she takes a lantern and makes her way, with only one lady-in-waiting for company, to the gallery overlooking the gardens. The wet stone glistens in the moonlight, and the bare branches cast thin shadows on the ground. She stands there for a long while, the lantern light catching on her face, her thoughts unreadable. The only sound is the faint trickle of water from the fountain below and the distant hoot of an owl. When at last she turns away, she walks back toward her chambers with a steady, unhurried step. In the antechamber, she pauses to warm her hands at the fire before dismissing her lady for the night. Alone, she moves to the writing table, the same one where you have seen her begin and end so many days. The quill is in her hand almost before she has fully sat down, and the candle burns low as she writes. The Words flow quickly, but the paper is turned away from you, and you cannot read them. When she finishes, she folds the letter, seals it with a heavy stamp, and places it in a leather pouch. This she locks away in a small chest at her feet. Then, for a long moment, she simply sits, her gaze fixed on the flames in the hearth. The shadows move across her face, shifting like thoughts she will never share. At last, she rises, draws the curtains around her bed, and extinguishes the candles one by one. The chamber falls into darkness, the only light coming from the dying fire. Outside, the rain begins again, soft and steady, as the queen lies down to sleep. The morning breaks with a pale, watery light, as if the sun itself is reluctant to rise over the palace. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the night's rain. The corridors are hushed, not with the languor of rest, but with the careful movements of people who know something is afoot. Footsteps echo softly on the stone floors, and whispers flit like moths from one servant to another. Elizabeth is already awake when you see her, seated at her table with a tray of bread, cheese, and a steaming cup of spiced wine before her. She eats little, breaking the bread into small pieces she doesn't finish. Beside her, a map lies spread open, pinned down by a silver candlestick. She traces the outline of the coastline with one finger, pausing at certain inlets as though committing them to memory. A knock at the door brings Walsingham into the room. His face is drawn tight, his eyes shadowed from a night without sleep. He speaks quickly, handing her a folded paper sealed with red wax. She reads it silently, her face impassive, then folds it again and sets it aside. "We will not act until we are certain," she says, her voice calm but firm. Walsingham bows and withdraws, his boots leaving faint marks of dampness on the rush-strewn floor. Not long after, the council is summoned again, this time to the larger chamber near the great hall. It is a room built for the gravity of state matters, with heavy oak beams overhead and tall windows that let in the gray morning light. The counselors take their places around the long table, some standing in small knots as they murmur among themselves before Elizabeth arrives. When she enters, the room stills at once. She takes her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding without need for raised voice or grand gesture. The discussion turns quickly to matters of foreign correspondence, letters from ambassadors in Madrid and Paris, reports from merchants recently returned from the Low Countries, coded messages intercepted from ships in the Channel. Some of the news is conflicting, and more than once she raises a hand to halt an argument between two counselors. "We will have order," she says, her gaze moving from one to the other until they both fall silent. By midday, the meeting adjourns, though its business feels unfinished. As the counselors disperse, you notice her linger by the window, looking out over the inner court. The rain has ceased, but the clouds remain low, making the day dim even at its height. She stays there for some moments, her hand resting lightly on the windowsill before turning away. The afternoon is given over to audiences, These are different from the usual stream of petitioners. Today's visitors are men of rank, lords from the northern counties, their cloaks travel-stained, their expressions guarded. They bring news of movements near the border, not yet confirmed, but troubling enough to draw them to London. Elizabeth hears them out, questioning each in turn, her voice steady, her eyes watchful. She does not betray either alarm or relief, only a measured acceptance of their words. Promises are made to send riders for further confirmation, and she dismisses them with courteous thanks, though you can see the thoughts turning behind her calm expression. After they leave, she withdraws to her privy chamber with only a single lady in attendance. The room is quiet save for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of her quill against paper. She writes 2 letters, both sealed immediately upon completion, and gives them to a waiting page with instructions to deliver them by hand before nightfall. By late afternoon, the palace seems to grow restless again. Servants pass quickly through the halls with covered trays and folded garments. Messengers slip in and out of side doors, and guards are stationed more visibly near the main entrances. You hear fragments of conversation, ships, weather delays, the word arrival repeated more than once. As evening draws near, the great hall is prepared for a smaller, more private supper. Only a handful of guests are admitted: a foreign envoy from Venice, 2 trusted counselors, and a scholar known for his work in cartography. The table is set with modest care, silver candlesticks, polished goblets, bread still warm from the oven. Elizabeth presides over the meal with a mix of attentiveness and quiet reserve. She listens more than she speaks, allowing the envoy to recount the latest events from the Venetian court, occasionally asking a question sharp enough to draw a more revealing answer. The scholar presents her with a newly drawn map of the northern seas, the ink still smelling faintly fresh. She studies it carefully, her fingers brushing over the fine lines marking coasts and harbors. Knowledge of the waters, she remarks, is as fine a weapon as any blade. The scholar beams at her approval, and the map is placed carefully in a leather tube for safekeeping. After the meal, instead of retiring immediately, she leads her small company to a chamber warmed by a large hearth. Here, a lute player is waiting, the instrument already tuned. The music is soft and low, weaving through the air like smoke. Elizabeth sits near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and lets the melody play out. From time to time, she glances toward the envoy, as though weighing his reactions as much as she weighs the music. When the evening ends, she dismisses her company with gracious words, then walks alone through the corridor, leading back to her apartments. The palace is quieter now, the air carrying the faint scent of beeswax from the candles. In her chambers, she removes her gown with the help of her waiting woman, changing into a robe of deep blue velvet. She spends the last hour of the day at her writing table once more, the candlelight pooling on the parchment before her. This letter she writes slowly, pausing often, as though considering each word with care. When at last it is sealed, She holds it for a moment in her hand before setting it aside. The fire is banked low, the curtains drawn, the chamber settling into stillness. Outside, the clouds break just enough for a sliver of moonlight to touch the windows. Elizabeth sits for a while longer, her gaze distant, before finally rising and retreating behind the bed curtains. The light fades, and the palace sinks into the quiet of night, its heartbeat steady but watchful. The next morning feels heavier, as if the air itself is reluctant to stir. A faint mist clings to the gardens beyond the palace walls, curling low over the clipped hedges and gravel paths. You walk slowly, your steps muffled by the dampness in the air, the distant caw of a raven breaking the otherwise perfect stillness. Inside, the palace is already alive with quiet industry. Servants move in measured haste, their eyes lowered, their arms burdened with trays, linens, and bundles of papers. Somewhere nearby, the muffled thud of boots signals the arrival of riders, their cloaks streaked with mud from the road. Elizabeth is in her privy chamber, her hair unbound, falling in loose waves over the shoulders of a plain morning gown. The simplicity is deliberate. This is not yet the hour for courtly display. She sits near the window, the light striking her face in a way that makes her appear both younger and more tired. Before her lies a spread of papers, some in her own hand, others clearly written by different scribes. She's reading quickly, marking margins with tiny, precise notes, sometimes pausing to tap the feathered end of her quill against her cheek in thought. The knock that comes is light but urgent. One of her ladies slips in, followed closely by a tall man carrying a sealed packet. The man bows low, murmuring a greeting before offering the packet. She takes it without ceremony, breaking the seal immediately. The letter within is shorter than most, but as her eyes move down the page, the faint crease in her brow deepens. She folds it slowly, deliberately, and lays it on the table. "Send for Walsingham," she says, her voice barely above a murmur, though it carries with an authority that needs no repetition. When he arrives, his usual composed mask is intact, though his eyes dart briefly toward the folded letter. She allows him to read it in silence. His reaction is small, a subtle shift of weight, a slow exhale, but it is enough to confirm what you already sense. This message is not routine. The two speak quietly for several minutes, their words too low to catch, and when they finish, he leaves with the letter in hand, his pace quickening as soon as he passes beyond her sight. By mid-morning, she has changed into a gown of deeper color, the richer fabric signaling a day when appearances must be carefully curated. In the presence chamber, the usual audience with courtiers is replaced by a narrower gathering. Only her most trusted advisors and a few carefully chosen guests. The talk is of troop movements, intercepted correspondence, and rumors filtering through merchant ships from the Low Countries. No decision is announced, but every glance, every clipped phrase feels weighted, as though the air in the room is thick with things unsaid. Later, as the gathering disperses, you follow her into the long gallery, where tall windows open onto the misty gardens. She walks slowly, trailing her fingers along the back of a carved chair, her gaze unfocused. It is here that one of her ladies approaches with a small wooden box. The queen opens it to reveal a collection of miniature portraits, each barely larger than a coin. She studies them one by one. Some are faded with age, others freshly painted, the colors still vivid. Her hand lingers over one before she closes the box and hands it back without comment. Historians still argue whether these portraits were tokens from potential suitors or reminders of allies and enemies alike. Either way, they clearly stir some thought that she keeps to herself. The midday meal is quiet, taken in a smaller chamber away from the public rooms. Only 2 companions join her, a cousin from the Suffolk branch of the family and a visiting scholar of astronomy. The scholar speaks with enthusiasm about a recent comet, describing it as a fiery sword hanging over the night sky. Elizabeth listens with faint amusement, remarking that the stars are fine for navigation, but poor as prophets. Still, you notice the way she asks for the comet's path to be drawn out on a scrap of parchment, folding it neatly to keep. The afternoon brings an unexpected arrival, a messenger from the northern border, his horse exhausted, his boots coated in layers of dust and clay. He is ushered in quickly, and though he kneels low before her, his words are delivered with the urgency of one who has not slept in days. The report is troubling. Signs of increased activity beyond the border, patrols sighted where none should be. She questions him closely, pressing for details, her tone patient but unyielding. When he finishes, she orders him to be fed and rested before he is sent onward to Walsingham for further debriefing. By late afternoon, the mist has lifted, revealing a sky streaked with pale gold. The queen takes a turn in the gardens, walking between the hedges and gravel paths. The scent of damp earth and late roses lingers in the air. She pauses by a stone bench, running her hand along its cold surface before sitting. A small spaniel joins her, trotting up with the eager gait of a creature who knows its welcome. She strokes its head absently, her gaze turned toward the palace, as if seeing something far beyond its walls. As the day edges toward evening, preparations begin for a supper of unusual intimacy. Only a handful of guests are invited: a representative from the Hanseatic League, 2 senior counselors, and a young poet whose verses have recently caught her favor. The table is set with silver plates and candles that throw long, wavering shadows on the walls. The talk ranges from trade agreements to the peculiarities of rhyming couplets, the queen steering the conversation with ease. She teases the poet gently about a metaphor involving swans, suggesting that he might find truer inspiration in the politics of poultry, her humor drawing soft laughter from the table. After the meal, the group moves to a smaller chamber where a globe is brought in, its surface freshly updated with recent discoveries. She spins it slowly, her fingers brushing over coastlines and oceans, pausing on places she will never see in person. The world grows larger each year, she says softly, yet somehow it presses closer upon us. The counselors nod, but it is the poet who dares to ask whether she would ever wish to travel beyond England's shores. She smiles faintly, offering only, "The Queen must always be where she is most needed." The evening winds down with music, lute and viol, their notes threading softly through the warm air. Elizabeth sits with her hands folded, her expression unreadable in the shifting candlelight. From time to time, her eyes flick toward the counselors, weighing their silences as much as their words earlier in the night. When at last she retires, the corridors are lit by only a few scattered torches. In her chambers, the gown is laid aside, the jewels stored away. She stands for a moment at the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. The moon is high now, silvering the gravel paths and the tops of the hedges. Her reflection wavers in the glass, a pale double watching her from the other side. Without a word, she turns away, drawing the curtains against the night. The fire burns low, the candlelight softens, and the palace settles once again into the deep, guarded quiet that seems to hold its breath until morning. Following morning begins with a sharp chill that seeps through the stone walls, making even the tapestries seem to shiver. In the outer rooms of the palace, the sound of hurried footsteps echoes, accompanied by the occasional clatter of a dropped tray or bucket. The Queen rises earlier than usual, the faint light of dawn barely breaking over the eastern horizon. She wears a heavy wool gown of deep russet, its warmth favored over courtly elegance for now, and her hair is braided simply, more practical than decorative. On the table by her bedside lies a sheet of parchment folded in thirds, the seal unbroken. It must have been delivered sometime in the night. She does not open it immediately, instead moving first to the window to watch the fog lift from the fields beyond the palace. Her breath mists the glass. Only when the light begins to grow stronger does she return to the table and break the seal. The letter is written in an unfamiliar hand, the ink a shade darker than most, as if pressed from a fresh, heavy batch. She reads quickly, her eyes darting back over certain lines, the corners of her mouth tightening. When she finishes, she holds the letter in the flame of a nearby candle until it curls and blackens, dropping the last ember into a basin of water. A knock at the door brings in her first audience of the day, Walsingham himself, along with a clerk carrying a leather satchel. They speak in low voices, the clerk producing documents that the Queen studies carefully. Maps are unrolled across the table, their surfaces dotted with colored pins. Walsingham points to one particular cluster near the coast, his finger circling a small inlet with deliberate slowness. She listens, interrupting only once to clarify a figure. The conversation lasts longer than usual, and when it ends, she dismisses the clerk, but keeps Walsingham for a private word. Whatever is exchanged between them is brief and decisive. He bows and departs without a backward glance. In the hours that follow, the palace grows steadily noisier. A train of visitors has arrived from the west, their cloaks dusted with frost. They bring gifts, a length of fine Welsh wool, several small casks of mead, and a set of carved chessmen. But the true purpose of their visit is business. In the audience chamber, the queen listens to their petitions, her tone alternating between brisk and gracious, depending on the speaker. At one point, a young man, evidently new to such proceedings, stumbles over his words and drops to his knees mid-sentence. Rather than allow the awkwardness to linger, she offers a small, reassuring smile and gestures for him to stand, her voice softening just enough to put him at ease. The midday meal is taken in the larger hall today, an intentional display for the visiting party. Long tables are set with trenchers of bread, roasted fowl, and bowls of spiced fruit. The queen presides from the high table, speaking to those nearest her while keeping an eye on the room as a whole. Musicians play quietly at one side, their melodies threading beneath the hum of conversation. When the meal ends, the visitors present her with a formal address of loyalty, which she accepts with words of thanks that are warm without committing to more than she intends. After the hall is cleared, she retreats to the library. The room smells faintly of parchment and the faint, sweet tang of beeswax polish. Tall shelves stretch upward, the upper volumes reachable only by a rolling ladder. She moves among the books, selecting one bound in dark leather, its spine cracked from frequent use. The volume is in Latin, and though she reads it easily, she pauses often to make marginal notes in her fine, compact script. From time to time, she looks up toward the high windows, where pale light filters in like the last wash of winter sun. It is in this quiet that a messenger arrives, carrying a narrow scroll sealed with the crest of a northern ally. She reads it immediately, her brow furrowing. Without a word, she places the scroll on the table and leaves the library at a brisk pace, summoning 2 counselors to follow. They speak as they walk through the gallery, the echoes of their voices blending with the steady rhythm of their footsteps. Whatever is discussed prompts one of the men to break away toward the stables, presumably to dispatch riders. By late afternoon, the air has shifted. The frost that clung to the morning has given way to a brittle kind of sunshine, the kind that does little to warm, but brightens the stonework in pale gold. The queen steps outside into the upper garden, her cloak drawn tightly around her. She pauses at a fountain, its basin thinly iced over, and breaks the surface with the tip of her glove. The sound of crackling ice is strangely satisfying in the stillness. She remains there for several minutes, watching the water ripple beneath the fragments before turning back toward the palace. The evening's supper is not public. Only a handful of trusted faces gather in the smaller dining room, the table lit by no more than a dozen candles. The conversation is more subdued than usual, focused on matters too delicate for broader ears. A servant refills her goblet, but she drinks sparingly, her attention fixed on the words of a senior advisor who has just returned from the continent. His report is detailed, touching on shifting alliances and the peculiar behavior of a foreign envoy. At one point, the queen leans back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she considers a piece of information that seems to catch her unawares. She does not comment on it directly, instead steering the conversation toward related subjects, drawing out more than the advisor perhaps intended to share. After the meal, she asks for the poet from the previous night to be brought in. He arrives looking faintly bewildered at the summons, but composes himself quickly. She requests that he recite one of his verses, but midway through, she interrupts to ask whether he has ever considered writing on the nature of loyalty, not as an abstract virtue, but as a fragile bond that can be broken by the smallest of slights. The question hangs in the air. He answers cautiously, sensing that her interest lies beyond poetry. She thanks him nonetheless, dismissing him with a faint smile. As the palace quiets, she moves to her private chapel. The small space is lit by 2 tall candles, their flames bending in the faint draft from the door. She kneels for several minutes, her head bowed, before rising to stand in the flickering light. Her lips move silently, and though no one is close enough to hear, the expression on her face is not one of peace, but of calculation. When she returns to her chambers, a new document awaits her on the table, a list of names. She reads it slowly, her finger tapping lightly against the wood. At one name in particular, she stops, looking up toward the far wall as if considering a memory. She makes a single notation beside it, then sets the paper aside. The night deepens. Outside, frost is already settling over the gardens, turning the gravel paths into pale ribbons under the moonlight. In the distance, an owl calls once, twice, then is silent. Within the thick walls of the palace, the queen stands at her window, the cold air pressing in through the narrow opening. She watches until the moon slips behind a cloud, then closes the shutters with deliberate care. The latch clicks softly, a sound almost lost in the stillness, and the room settles into shadow. The first sound she hears in the morning is not the bell, but the quiet murmur of voices just beyond her door. They are not the usual attendants. The cadence is different, low, measured, as if each syllable is weighed before it is spoken. She rises without calling for her women, slipping into a heavy robe lined with fur. When she opens the door, the voices stop abruptly. 2 of Walsingham's men stand there, one holding a sealed packet, the other glancing toward the far end of the corridor, where another figure waits in the shadows. The packet is placed in her hands without explanation. She closes the door again before opening it, breaking the seal with her thumb. Inside is a short letter, written in code. She does not need the key to know the general meaning. The arrangement of certain symbols is already familiar. She walks to her writing table, unlocks a small compartment, and retrieves a slip of parchment where a partial cipher is kept. The message, once deciphered, confirms her suspicion. The man who had been loudly proclaiming loyalty in yesterday's audience is in correspondence with a household in exile. She sits for a long while, the letter before her, weighing whether to confront him directly or let him continue his correspondence so that more might be revealed. By the time her attendants arrive, she has hidden the message and chosen her gown, a deep green velvet with a high collar, the sort of color that photographs well in portraits and lingers in the memory of those who see her. The morning passes in the council chamber, where the discussion turns repeatedly to the cost of maintaining certain garrisons. Her treasurer outlines the figures, his voice thin with caution, while a younger counselor suggests that reductions could be made without risk. She listens, but the glimmer in her eyes suggests she has already decided otherwise. When she finally speaks, it is with quiet authority, ending the matter before further debate. After the council, she walks through the gallery where foreign gifts are displayed. There is a lacquered box from the East, a set of ivory carvings from Africa, and a silver mirror from the Low Countries. She pauses before the mirror, studying her reflection with the same scrutiny she gives to state papers. Behind her, a servant shifts uneasily, uncertain whether to speak. She waves him forward, and he informs her that a messenger from the north waits in the outer court. The messenger, when admitted, proves to be a young woman dressed plainly, but with the confident bearing of one accustomed to traveling alone. She kneels briefly before presenting a letter, which the queen opens on the spot. The contents are troubling, reports of unrest near the border, with rumors of certain lords gathering in secret. She questions the messenger closely, drawing out details of the terrain, the routes taken, the names overheard in whispered conversation. When she has learned all she can, she sends for Walsingham, instructing him to prepare a quiet inquiry. At midday, she dines privately with only one companion, an old friend from her childhood days. The talk turns, for a moment, to lighter matters. A jest about the poor singing of a certain courtier, the memory of a long-ago summer when the two of them slipped away from their attendants to ride unescorted in the fields. But beneath the laughter is a shared understanding that such freedoms are long gone. The meal ends with a promise to meet again before the week is out. Though both know that promises in the court are often broken by necessity, the afternoon is spent in correspondence. Her desk is soon covered with letters in various stages of completion, some written in her own hand, others dictated to a scribe and awaiting her seal. Each letter serves a purpose beyond its words, whether to reassure an ally, unsettle an enemy, or plant an idea that will bear fruit months from now. In one, she thanks a foreign prince for his gift of wine, while subtly questioning the quality of the vintage in a way that will surely reach his ears. In another, she expresses concern for the health of a certain ambassador's wife. Knowing that the message will be read as both courtesy and a reminder of her attentiveness to matters beyond politics. As the light fades, a page arrives to announce the arrival of the French envoy. The meeting is to take place in her withdrawing room, a space small enough to feel intimate, but large enough for formality. The envoy bows deeply before taking his seat, launching into a carefully rehearsed statement about trade privileges. She listens with polite interest, occasionally interjecting with a question that forces him off script. The conversation drifts, as she intends, toward matters of marriage alliances, a topic she treats as though it were of passing curiosity, though her eyes miss nothing in his reaction. When he departs, she remains standing for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the door he has just passed through. Then she calls for her women, instructing them to prepare her for the evening. The gown she chooses now is lighter, a silk of deep blue, and she allows her hair to be dressed more elaborately than in the morning. Tonight, the court gathers for music and poetry in the great hall, and she will be both participant and observer. The hall is already bright with torchlight when she enters. Courtiers bow low, musicians strike their instruments, and the hum of conversation fills the air. She moves among the guests, exchanging words here and there, never lingering too long in one place. A poet recites a new work in her honor, drawing polite applause, though she suspects his true audience lies elsewhere in the room. From time to time, she catches fragments of conversation names, dates, hints of meetings to come, and stores them away for later consideration. Midway through the evening, she notices a man at the edge of the gathering, his attire modest but his posture alert. She has seen him before, though she cannot place when. Rather than approach directly, she signals discreetly to one of her guards, who slips away and returns some minutes later with confirmation. The man is a clerk recently returned from the Low Countries, his loyalty untested. She makes no move to confront him tonight, preferring to let him remain under watch. The music swells, and dancers fill the floor. She joins for a single set, her movements graceful but measured. When the set ends, she withdraws to a raised dais, from where she can see the entire hall. From here, the court looks almost like a painting, bright colors, animated faces, the illusion of harmony. She knows better. The gathering ends late, and by the time she reaches her chambers, the palace is quiet save for the soft tread of guards in the corridors. She dismisses her attendants early, wanting a moment alone. At her writing table, she takes out the cipher letter from the morning, unfolding it once more. She studies it by candlelight, considering the man it implicates. The wax drips slowly down the taper as she weighs the balance between mercy and necessity. At last, she takes up her quill and writes a single instruction on a slip of paper, sealing it with her signet. The paper is placed in the small locked box on her desk to be delivered at dawn. She sets the key beneath her pillow before extinguishing the candle. The night is still, but in her dreams there is movement, shadows along the wall, voices calling from just beyond the edge of hearing. She wakes once, certain that someone has spoken her name, but the room is empty. Only the faint silver of moonlight spills across the floor, and the sound of the wind against the shutters fills the silence. She lies awake until the first pale light of morning creeps into the room, her thoughts already turning to the tasks ahead. The dawn broke with a thin veil of mist over the gardens, softening the edges of the hedgerows and turning the distant towers into shapes from another world. She stood at her window for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of damp earth and crushed grass, before the stirrings of the palace intruded footsteps in the hall, the clang of a pail somewhere below. A muffled laugh quickly hushed. She allowed her women to enter then, their arms full of silks and linens. their voices already busy with the day's gossip. She listened without appearing to, catching the threads of some new rumor about a baron's son caught in debt, another about a lady who might be with child, though the supposed father was not her husband. The queen knew that these morsels, shared in whispers over pins and combs, were as valuable as any report from a spy. She asked one or two casual questions as her hair was brushed and braided, gleaning more than her women realized they had revealed. The robe she wore for breakfast was modest in cut, but rich in fabric, a compromise she often used when she wished to appear approachable without sacrificing her authority. At the small table by the hearth, she found Walsingham waiting, already seated with his own trencher of bread and cheese. He rose and bowed, then wasted no time in setting before her a stack of folded papers. The topmost was a fresh intelligence report from the coast. A ship, flying a neutral flag, had anchored for repairs, but its manifest listed cargo that did not match what had been sighted being unloaded in the night. She traced a finger along the edge of the paper, her mind already fitting this into the larger web of alliances and threats. They spoke quietly while servants moved in and out, discussing which port officials could be trusted and which needed careful watching. Walsingham mentioned a name she did not expect, one belonging to a man she had dined with not 2 nights past. She betrayed no surprise, only nodding slightly before changing the subject to the weather, as though the matter were too slight to warrant more. Yet, inwardly, she was making a list of who must be invited to supper in the coming week. Once Walsingham had departed, she summoned her master of the revels. A tournament had been proposed by certain ambitious young lords, and she wanted every detail approved before giving her consent. The master spread out his plans, full of pageantry and display, but she was more interested in the guest lists, the order of events, the positions where she herself would sit. A tournament could be sport, but it could also be a field for subtle politics, a place to show favor or withdraw it, to hint at alliances without committing to them. She altered the order of the jousts, pairing certain rivals together, ensuring that those she trusted least would face each other early, where any incident could be contained. By late morning, she was in the gardens, ostensibly to take the air, but in truth to hold a private conversation with her cousin, who had recently returned from service abroad. They walked slowly between clipped yews, the sound of gravel underfoot masking their voices. Her cousin spoke of unrest in certain provinces, the discontent of merchants over new levies, the murmurings of men who had once sworn loyalty to the crown, but now questioned the reach of its hand. The queen asked pointed questions about names, dates, and the tone of these murmurings. Were they mere grumblings, or did they have the shape of intent? Her cousin hesitated before admitting that some were indeed moving beyond talk. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and turned the conversation to the merits of late-blooming roses. Back in her private study, she found a letter waiting, brought by a courier who had traveled through the night. The seal seal was unfamiliar, but the handwriting within was not. It belonged to a woman she had met only once, years ago, whose husband had since fallen into disgrace. The letter was a plea for help, framed in the language of shared loyalty, but between the lines, it carried something sharper, a warning that certain old enemies were stirring again. The Queen read it twice, then locked it away with other papers in a small chest whose key never left her person. The midday meal was taken in the presence chamber, where several minor nobles sought her ear. One spoke of a dispute over land boundaries. Another pressed for a license to export wool. She answered each with a courtesy that revealed nothing of her true thoughts, offering neither promise nor refusal. At the same table, a young lord told a story so obviously fabricated that she almost smiled. His purpose was to draw attention away from a companion who had grown pale and silent. She let him succeed, making a note to have the silent one discreetly followed. In the early afternoon, the ambassador from Spain requested an audience. He came bearing gifts, an ornate reliquary, and a casket of fine citrus fruits, and words of friendship that were pleasant enough on the surface. Yet each phrase was turned in such a way as to remind her of debts owed, of obligations that might be called upon. She parried with equal skill, accepting the gifts with warmth, while making it clear that her goodwill was neither bought nor bound. When he departed, her face was still smiling, but the moment the door closed, her hand tightened briefly on the arm of her chair. Later, she retired to her library, a high room lined with books in several languages, maps of known seas, and globes marked with the routes of explorers. Here she felt most herself, away from the constant theater of court. She spent an hour reading dispatches from her agents, another hour reviewing the accounts for a shipyard whose loyalty was in question. The figures told their own story: timber purchased, but unaccounted for, payments made to men whose names did not appear on any muster roll. She marked these in the margin, then sent for a clerk to prepare a formal inquiry. As the sun began to lower, she received her musicians for a brief rehearsal. Music was both her pleasure and a tool. The choice of songs could be a signal, a performance a message. Tonight, she selected a ballad that spoke of constancy in the face of betrayal, instructing the singers to emphasize certain lines. She knew that at least 3 people in the audience would understand the meaning was meant for them. The evening meal was a smaller gathering, just 6 at the table, chosen with care. There was laughter, but also the undercurrent of careful speech, for each guest knew that the Queen's attention was never truly relaxed. She asked after family members, offered condolences for minor losses, spoke warmly of shared memories, yet all the while she was measuring how each person responded, noting who met her gaze and who avoided it, whose answers came smoothly and who stumbled. After supper, the group moved to the withdrawing room, where wine was poured and the talk grew looser. One gentleman, emboldened by drink, spoke too freely of matters that should have remained behind closed doors. She let him speak, nodding as though she found his story amusing, but the flicker in her eyes was cold. When the evening ended, she sent him away with a smile and a word of thanks, then called for one of Walsingham's men. By the time she returned to her bedchamber, the palace was quiet again. She dismissed her women, keeping only a single candle burning as she undressed. At the small desk in the corner, she opened the locked box and took out the letter from that morning. She read it once more, then, with deliberate care, held it to the candle flame until it curled and blackened, the ashes falling into a brass dish. Some things, she knew, were better consigned to smoke than kept as proof. She slept lightly, waking once to the sound of footsteps outside her door. A guard's voice murmured something she could not catch, followed by the faint click of a latch. She lay still until the silence returned, then drifted into uneasy dreams, faces half seen, voices whispering her name. The sense of being watched from just beyond the circle of light. When morning came, she was already awake, sitting at her table with quill in hand. The list she was making was short but precise. Names to be questioned, places to be watched, letters to be written. She knew that by the end of the week, some of those names would be gone from the court, and others would rise in their place. The game never ended. It merely shifted its pieces, and she would play it until there were no moves left. The rain had begun in the night, steady and unhurried, soaking the flagstones and making the air smell of wet stone and wood smoke. She watched it from her chamber window while her women moved quietly about the room, laying out her gown, heating water for washing, speaking in the hushed tones people used when they knew something was amiss, but were not certain what. There was a tension in the palace that morning, a sense that some unseen thread had been tugged, and she meant to discover by whose hand. When she stepped into the presence chamber, she saw at once that the usual order of the court had shifted. Clusters of men spoke in low voices, their eyes flicking toward her and away again. Women whispered behind fans. Even the servants moved faster than usual, as if they wished to be away from the room. She crossed the floor slowly, her expression composed, acknowledging bows and curtsies without pausing. At her seat, she took the proffered cup of spiced wine and let the warmth settle in her hands before looking to Walsingham, who was already waiting, a sealed packet in his grasp. He laid it before her without a word. She broke the seal and read the short note within. It was in cipher, but she had long since learned to read the shapes of certain hands without needing them fully unraveled. The message was stark. A rider had been intercepted before dawn, carrying documents bound for the coast. The name of the addressee was one that should not have been in correspondence with anyone beyond the kingdom's borders. She refolded the paper slowly, as if it were of no importance, and asked aloud about the arrangements for the afternoon's council meeting. Walsingham inclined his head, understanding her need for appearances, and withdrew. The meeting, when it came, was thick with the stale air of politics. Old grievances were aired under the guise of new proposals, and one lord in particular pressed for increased levies to fund coastal defenses. She listened, fingers steepled under her chin, while behind her calm gaze She weighed how much he knew of the intercepted courier. His eagerness to fund the coast might be the mark of loyalty, or the mark of someone eager to keep watch for his own purposes. She gave her assent to further discussion, nothing more. After the council, she walked alone in the long gallery, pausing now and then to look out at the rain-blurred gardens. She was joined unexpectedly by a lady of the bedchamber, one whose chatter was usually light and harmless. Today, however, the lady's tone carried the edge of careful intent. She spoke of a banquet given in the city 2 nights past, of certain guests who had lingered long after the official company had departed. The names she let fall were ones the Queen had been hearing too often of late, names now linked to whispers of discontent. She feigned mild interest, thanking the lady for the tale, and promised to send her a bolt of silk for her trouble. In the late afternoon, she received the intercepted documents. Spread across her desk, they were a tangle of coded lines, small sketches, and lists of seemingly ordinary goods: barrels of salt fish, bolts of cloth, casks of wine. Yet the routes and quantities, when read in the right order, told a story of supplies being shifted in secret to a harbor known for its discreet captains. She traced the ink with one finger, then set the papers aside and called for a trusted clerk. In a voice too low for the servants beyond the door to hear, she dictated a series of messages. One to delay a shipment from leaving port, another to summon the captain of her own guard, and a third to be sent to a man in the north whose loyalty had never been in doubt. As evening fell, she attended a small supper hosted by the French ambassador. The food was delicate, the wine rich, and the talk a dance of veiled meaning. He inquired after her health, her plans for the winter, the condition of her fleet. She answered with equal courtesy, never quite revealing more than he already knew, yet letting slip just enough to keep him guessing. At one point, he remarked on the rain and how it must hinder travel. She smiled faintly, knowing the remark was a probe. Was she aware of any journey now delayed? She replied that rain could be both an inconvenience and a protection, depending on who wished to be on the road. When she returned to her chambers, she found a sealed letter waiting on her writing table. The wax bore no seal she recognized, but the hand was hurried, the ink uneven. It warned her, without salutation or signature, that a meeting was to take place the next night in a tavern by the river, where men would speak freely of things they would not dare utter within the palace walls. She read it twice, then placed it in the small chest with her other private papers. She would decide in the morning whether to send someone in her stead or attend in disguise, as she had done in years past. The rain continued through the night, drumming softly on the leaded panes. She lay awake for some time, thinking of the pieces moving unseen beyond the court's reach, and of the moment when she might be forced to bring them into the open. Sleep came only when she had resolved upon 3 different courses of action, each dependent on the turn of the next day's events. By morning, the skies had cleared to a pale, washed blue, and the air held the clean scent of rain-washed stone. She dressed more plainly than usual, her gown of dark green velvet relieved only by a narrow band of pearls at the throat. When she entered the presence chamber, the murmur of voices dropped, and she saw the subtle shift in posture that meant something had changed. Walsingham was already there, his expression as unreadable as ever, but the look in his eyes told her he had news. In her privy chamber, he spoke quickly. The man to whom the intercepted papers had been addressed had left the city before dawn, taking the road to the coast. A rider had been sent after him, but whether he could be overtaken was uncertain. She gave orders for the harbor to be closed to all departures, citing a matter of quarantine that would explain the delay without revealing its true cause. Walsingham inclined his head, already turning over in his mind how best to enforce the order without stirring greater suspicion. The rest of the morning she spent in audiences, hearing petitions from merchants, clerics, and minor gentry. A few brought genuine grievances, others sought favor or exemption from laws that bound their neighbors. She granted some requests, refused others, all the while measuring the undercurrents of who spoke for whom, and which alliances were shifting beneath the surface. At midday, she sent her women away and sat alone at her desk, the intercepted documents before her once more. She considered the possibility that they were a ruse, meant to draw her attention from some other, greater threat. Yet, the pattern of goods and destinations felt too deliberate to be mere distraction. She marked 2 names in the margin, both ship captains known for their discretion and their prices. One, she suspected, had been in the pay of her enemies for years. The other might still be turned if approached with care. In the afternoon, she received word that the tavern mentioned in the anonymous letter was already under quiet observation. 2 of Walsingham's men, dressed as laborers, had taken seats in the corner and would send word if anything of note was heard. She considered going herself, the thought stirring a restless excitement she rarely indulged. But caution prevailed. Too much depended on her remaining visible at court. Instead, she planned a small supper, inviting a handful of guests whose presence would send a subtle message to those who thought they could move unseen. That evening, the supper passed with easy conversation and well-played music, yet every word and glance was calculated. She drew out one gentleman on the subject of recent shipping delays, watched another's reaction when she mentioned the name of the coastal town linked to the intercepted goods. By the time the plates were cleared, she had gleaned enough to confirm her suspicions. The movement of supplies was real, and its purpose was not innocent. When her guests had gone, she retired to her library, where a small fire still burned. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring into the flames. The path ahead was dangerous, too heavy a hand, and she risked driving her enemies deeper into hiding. Too light a touch, and they might complete their work before she could stop them. Somewhere between the two lay the course she must take, and she would have to find it quickly. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying the scent of the river and the distant tang of the sea. She thought of the ships riding at anchor, the unseen hands loading their holds by lantern light, and of the man on the road to the coast, his mind set on whatever meeting awaited him there. She rose at last, crossing to the window, and let the cool air wash over her face. Tomorrow, she told herself, the game would turn again, and she would be ready to move her pieces where they must go, no matter who stood in the way. She woke before dawn, the chamber still cloaked in darkness save for the faint ember glow from the fire. There was no sound in the palace but the distant creak of timbers and the faint, rhythmic step of the sentries outside. She lay still for a moment, letting her senses adjust, and then rose without calling her women. Moving quietly, she crossed to the table where the intercepted letters lay, spread like a puzzle waiting to be solved. By the dim light of the embers, she examined them again, her eyes catching on a symbol in the margin she had overlooked before, a small, deliberate flourish beneath one of the names. It was a mark she had seen years ago on a treaty forged in secret, a mark belonging to a man who had since vanished from public life. If he was moving again, it meant the currents beneath the kingdom's surface ran deeper than she had feared. By the time the first pale light seeped into the room, she had summoned her clerk. She dictated a coded message, its meaning hidden under the guise of an order for rare spices to be sent to the palace kitchens. The destination, however, was not the kitchens, but a small outpost along the northern coast, and the spice merchant was in fact one of her most reliable watchers. When the message was dispatched, she allowed her women to enter, submitting to the ritual of dressing, as though nothing unusual had passed her mind that morning. The day's first audience brought her a delegation from the Guild of Goldsmiths, who sought her approval for a new set of trade regulations. Their spokesman was courteous, but there was a sharpness to his tone that spoke of urgency. She granted him a provisional charter, though she knew well that his true business was not with gold at all, but with information. As he bowed his way out, she caught the briefest flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. He had understood her unspoken command to meet in private that evening. In the council chamber, tempers flared over a matter of tariffs on imported wool. The discussion was long and tedious, but she listened with care. Amid the wrangling, a lord from the western shires let slip a passing remark about certain ports being quieter than usual. It was said as if to support his argument for lower tariffs, but she marked the words in her mind. If those ports were indeed seeing less activity, it could mean that goods, and perhaps people, were being routed elsewhere. At midday, Walsingham returned from his rounds with news from the tavern. 2 men had spoken openly of a shipment due to depart under cover of darkness within the week. The cargo, they claimed, was worth more than any in recent memory, though they spoke in such general terms that it was impossible to tell if they meant coin, goods, or something less tangible. They also mentioned a name she recognized from the intercepted documents, though they did so in the tone of men confident their company was loyal. That confidence would have to be broken, and quickly. The rest of the day unfolded with deliberate slowness. She took her supper alone, dismissing even her most trusted ladies early. In the quiet of her chamber, she penned 3 letters in her own hand, something she rarely did, for the sight of her handwriting was too dangerous to be allowed into the wrong possession. One was to a captain of the guard stationed near the mouth of the river, ordering him to increase patrols and report any unusual traffic. Another went to the master of the royal stables, instructing him to have fresh horses ready on short notice, though she gave no reason. The third she hesitated over, for it was to a man she had not contacted in years, a man whose loyalty was not certain, but whose skill in uncovering hidden plots was unmatched. She sealed all 3 with the plain signet she used for personal correspondence, then placed them in Walsingham's hands herself. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before, drumming on the roofs and sluicing down the gutters. It would slow the roads, perhaps delay the shipment she had heard of, but it might also provide cover for those who wished to move unseen. She stood at the window, watching the lightning flicker far off over the hills, and wondered how many others in the city were awake, watching the same storm, making their own calculations. When morning came, the air was thick and damp, the light pale and strained. Word arrived from the coast before she had even broken her fast. The man who had fled the city 2 days ago had been seen entering an old warehouse near the harbor. The warehouse was nominally abandoned, but she knew it well. It had been used in years past to store grain in times of shortage. Its owner was a merchant of middling influence, outwardly loyal, but with ties to families who had once plotted against her crown. She gave orders for the building to be watched, but not entered, not yet. If the man believed himself secure, he might lead them to others. Later that day, the goldsmith came to her private rooms under the pretense of delivering a newly cast medallion. In the cover of the withdrawing room, he spoke in low tones of a ship called the Morning Star, due to leave for the Low Countries within 3 nights. It was said to carry only wool and tin, but he had heard from a dockworker that its true cargo would be loaded in the dead of night, from smaller boats rowing in from the river mouth. She dismissed him with thanks, telling him to make a show of presenting the medallion before the court, so that no one would question his presence. In the late afternoon, she walked through the gardens, her steps slow on the damp gravel paths. The air smelled of earth and crushed leaves, the fountains running fast with rainwater. It was a place where the court rarely intruded, and she used it to speak with Walsingham without the risk of ears behind doors. They discussed the ship, the warehouse, and the possibility that both were part of the same design. He proposed a raid on the warehouse that night, but she shook her head. Better to let the prey gather before the net was drawn. She instructed him instead to place men in the harbor and along the riverbank, hidden but ready. That evening, she held a small mask, inviting the most talkative and ambitious members of her court. It was not amusement she sought, but information, for amid the wine and music tongues loosened. She danced once, then withdrew to a seat where she could watch without seeming to. She noted who spoke to whom, who avoided certain company, and whose eyes flickered toward the door each time it opened. By the time the mask ended, she had seen enough to add 2 more names to her mental list of those to watch. The following morning, news came that the Morning Star had shifted her position in the harbor under cover of fog, anchoring nearer to the river mouth. The captain claimed it was to avoid a sandbank, but she suspected otherwise. The warehouse, too, showed signs of unusual activity. Lamps burning late into the night, crates moved in and out with no record kept at the custom house. The moment was coming when she would have to act. She spent the afternoon in her library, reviewing old accounts of similar plots, times when the court had been infiltrated by those loyal to other crowns, when goods and gold had flowed unseen through the kingdom's ports to fund rebellion or worse. The patterns were familiar, though never identical. Those who plotted against her were cautious, but they could not erase the traces of human habit: greed, pride, the need for allies. As dusk fell, she sent word for her most trusted guards to meet her in the lower hall. They came without question, armed but dressed in plain cloaks. She told them only that they would be riding to the river that night, and that they would follow her orders without hesitation. Walsingham joined them, carrying a map marked with the positions of every watchman and hidden sentry. The plan was simple. They would shadow the smaller boats from the river mouth to their landing, then seize both the cargo and those who carried it. The ride through the night was silent save for the muffled thud of hooves on wet earth. They kept to the shadows, moving along the lesser-used paths. The moon was hidden behind clouds, the air sharp with the smell of salt and river mud. Near midnight, they saw the first of the boats, a dark shape slipping upriver, rowed by men who kept their heads low. Another followed, then a third. She signaled to her guards, and they began their pursuit along the bank. The boats beached at a narrow strip of mud beneath the shadow of the old warehouse. Men leapt out, hauling crates to a hidden door. She gave the signal, and her guards moved in, swift and silent. The fight was brief but fierce, the clatter of weapons muffled by the night air. When it was over, the crates were theirs, along with 2 prisoners who would speak, if not tonight, then soon enough. Inside the warehouse, by the light of a single lantern, she saw the contents of the crates. Not wool, not tin, but muskets, powder, and shot. Enough to arm a company, perhaps 2. And there, in the shadows at the back, stood the man who had fled the city. He was bound before he could reach the stairs, his eyes wide with the knowledge that whatever hope he had of escape was gone. By dawn, they were back within the palace walls, the prisoners under guard, and the contraband locked away. She stood at the window of her chamber, watching the first light strike the wet rooftops. The storm had passed, but she knew the game was far from over. This was only one strand of a larger web, and she had only just begun to unravel it.